Magandang araw, Podmates! Howie Severino muli na nagpapaalala na nakakatalino ang mahabang attention span. May kasama na naman akong dakilang Pilipino, isang batang journalist na reporter para sa isa sa pinaka-maimpluwensyang news organization sa mundo, si Regine Cabato, ang Philippine correspondent ng Washington Post, ang dyaryong tiyak na binabasa ng mga pangulo ng Amerika. Magandang araw, Regine, at buenos dias! I know you're a Chabacano speaker from Zamboanga City.
Buenos dias, Sir Howie. Thank you for having me on your podcast today.
Regine, ang latest na major reportorial project mo para sa Washington Post ay tungkol sa so-called digital sweatshop sa Pilipinas na nasa industriya ng artificial intelligence o AI ang pinag-uusapan ng marami na bagong game changer sa mundo ng technology. Ngayon lang na may lumabas na ganitong anggulo sa AI, ano? Paano pa nag-exploit ng workers ang AI industry at paano mo natuklasan itong storyang ito?
Napakamalaking surprise talaga for us sa Washington Post nung nalaman namin to, no? Yung unang lead na para sa kwentong to nanggaling pa sa boss namin, sa boss ko, si Rebecca Tan, yung bureau chief ng Southeast Asia. So kami yung dalawang talagang nagre-report sa region na to. Matunog ngayon, 'di ba, ang AI. It's a buzzword nowadays, parang future ng economy natin, etc. It will change the face of work. Pero actually, nare-report na rin sa ibang bahagi ng mundo like in Africa, Venezuela na may ganito palang trabaho, ang tinatawag nating data annotators or yung workers behind AI, yung tumutulong sa pag-train ng AI. Pero itong report namin, parang ito siguro yung pinakaunang expose talaga na may ganito palang trabaho sa Pilipinas at medyo exploitative nga siya in nature because sa base sa nakuha naming or na-interview naming mga tao, karamihan ng mga workers, at least for this particular billion-dollar AI company, hindi silang nababayaran ng husto tsaka on time as well. So may mga potential labor violations not just for US standards but even for local Philippine law standards, no. So karamihan po kasi hindi natin, like, we think that AI just comes out of nowhere, like that it's just like a advanced technology, nasa future na tayo and everything, but actually it is a very shall we say clerical work if you trace the supply chain of it. Kasi yung knowledge ng AI, hindi naman yan nagagaling sa kahit saan-saan lang eh. Tao pa rin ang nag-e-encode niyan. At yun pa yung naging dahilan ng story namin na malaking bagay siya na hindi natin alam na a lot of the brains pala behind AI are also Filipino.
And this company that's supposedly exploiting these Filipino workers in the so-called digital sweatshops, no? This is the US company, but it has affiliates dito sa Pilipinas.
Yes, it has one affiliate dito sa Pilipinas. So medyo complicated yung company structure niya, Sir Howie, no? Ang tawag sa client-facing company, which is worth some $7 billion at malaking company ito sa Silicon Valley. It's called Scale AI, and it's run by 27-year-old billionaire who is kind of like a Silicon Valley darling. Ang dami nilang high-profile clients, including the US government, including Meta. So ang ginagawa nila, binebenta nila sa ganitong mga tech giants, sa ganitong giant tech companies, ang mga data sets that will train the AI that these tech companies develop. So yung data sets, parang doon, yun yung, for example, that's where footage, images, etc. That teaches the AI what different objects are, ganyan, yung training data ng AI. Yun yung binebenta nila. Yung Scale AI has a company under it or a platform under it called Remote Tasks. So yun yung, actually baka matunog nga siya sa ibang listeners ninyo, Sir Howie, because there was a time that it was very popular sa Pilipinas. At parang kakompetensya nito yung Upwork, if people have heard of that. At, so many online freelancers no get their work on sites like that. So, ang mga Filipino workers, nasa-source sila through this platform, through remote tasks. And then, the data sets are sold by Scale AI. At may local affiliate pa sila, yung Smart Ecosystems Philippines po.
And you call them in your report, no, taskers. Itong mga sinabi mo nga kind of digital clerical workers, no. They're taskers who annotate data. So I guess part of their task is, to enable these AI language models to distinguish nga between a tree and a pedestrian in the images, and provide all this data that has to have some human intervention, so that the machines can process these more or less accurately. So the bigger question here is, we've had troll farms, we've had BPOs, and is this much worse than other aspects of the digital industry? I mean, how would you compare this particular industry na nag-employ ng maraming Pilipino online versus previous stages of this technology age, when we've also had a lot of Filipinos working remotely for foreign clients?
Parang it seems to be, sir, no, that every other year may ganitong bagong new frontier of the digital economy in the Philippines. So a few years ago, like you mentioned, it was BPOs. And then a little bit after that, it was content moderation. Yung mga, it was a kind of BPO work where people filter the worst of the internet sa social media. Linilinis nila yung mga gore and violent content that we see online. And then now it's AI naman. Parang every year, because I think of the nature of the Philippines na, una, a lot of us are young, a lot of us are digitally savvy sa yung workforce natin. And not to mention, because we were colonized by the US, maraming mga English speaking. So communicative ang workforce natin. At gustong-gusto yan gusto-gusto yan sa global market, no? So parang yun yung reasons kung bakit it seems to be that this seems to keep happening to Filipinos in one way or another, no? Is this particularly worse? I'm not sure, but it seems to be a trend. Kaya it's very important for us to report on it. Like today it's AI, tomorrow it might be something else. Yesterday it was content moderators, the day before that BPOs, diba? So it's very important to bring these stories out to light, and it's also very important for government officials to understand, no, yung importance ng digital economy and the landscape of digital economy. Kasi yung laws natin obviously have not been able to catch up to these kinds of new innovations sa ating digital economy. So I'm also very I'm very curious then to find out how people will be responding to our article in terms of a policy siguro, and hopefully it brings more into awareness. But siguro just to clarify, Sir Howie, it's although this particular example of this one company we found is exploitative, and it was is potentially exploitative, no, because also of the Oxford study that rated this company as low in terms of yung labor fairness. There are other companies that do data annotation na okay naman sila magbayad, at least according to the workers. There are other companies naman that try to strive for some sort of ethical standards. Kaso, because nga this is an underground economy, people are not aware that these other companies exist. Parang hindi pang na-map out, no, in the public eye yung companies that have the best practices, yung standard dapat na wages para sa ganitong trabaho. I'm not sure how it was when BPOs first came into the scene, no? Maybe it was also like that at first, and then people started finding out more about it at standardized in some way. But I think that's why it's so important to talk about it, para people will learn that, oh, there are other companies that exist. This is too low of a price to be paying for this kind of work.
Yung story mo nga had a number of anecdotal horror stories of these workers not being paid, or they're being paid very low, or they're just being terminated, no? Na parang wala masyadong dahilan, and some of them really hate their jobs, but they're still working in the same for the same company because wala nga masyadong options. Your story ends without much hope, actually, no? Kasi it just seems like the exploitation will continue. Kasi parang the government officials you had talked to didn't seem to have much response. They in fact they said we don't know how to regulate this. Parang kalat-kalat yung mga workers. We don't even know how many they are. We don't know where they are. Etc. The company that's employing all these people are overseas. So parang there are a lot of these big questions that are hanging over this whole industry.
Yeah, it's really sad, no? And that's why also it's important for DICT officials, labor officials to kind of be ahead of the curve. Kasi this will keep happening eh. We're in a new age of social media, of digital economy, etc. So parang with all of these new sorts of platforms, there are bound to be some new ways also, new loopholes to the law pag hindi siyang na-update. So yeah, it's quite I really do hope something could be done about it. Kwento ko lang din siguro, Sir Howie, no, parang since you mentioned the anecdotes, one of the things that really struck me when we were speaking to a lot of the workers who were working in this job was that alam nila na linolobol sila. So there were a few workers, for example, that were just doing it part-time. So parang hindi sila masyadong invested. Pero there were also workers na aware sila that even though they don't know who exactly the clients are, they know that the company has ties to Silicon Valley. They know the company has ties to big tech companies. At sinasabi nila na alam ko na linolobol kaming mga Pinoy, linolobol because they view us like this, they view us as cheap labor, ganyan. So nakakalungkot, no? And hopefully there will hopefully be more awareness about it so that policy can be changed.
Yeah, there's this large debate now between benefits versus harm and dangers ng AI. Kasi of course, many of us use ChatGPT and to help us in our work and research and even thinking, no. So that's one pretty clear benefit, no. But in all of the discussion about harm, usually they dwell on yung mga bias ng algorithms, the potential for spreading disinformation, etc. But ngayon lang siguro nabasa ng marami yung tungkol dito sa the digital sweatshops, no. But I want to ask you, since you're also active in the journalism sector as a vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, ano yung posibleng impact naman sa journalism workers, no? Journalism is also a labor sector. We're workers, and we do mind work. And there's been a lot of talk about how artificial intelligence is going to make some aspects of our industry obsolete as far as human labor is concerned, or AI is going to displace journalists in a number of aspects of our profession. What's your thinking on this?
That is the fear nga, no, Sir Howie. So I'm actually quite curious also how the folks at GMA view it. I think at this point in time, though, there still is a little bit more premium on the human touch when it comes to journalism, because we can't still fully trust AI. I think when it comes to proper fact checking, yung rigor ng investigative process, no. I mean, AI is a tool, eh. It's a tool, but I think for a job like journalism, it's a helpful tool, but it can't replace the people who run the machine. At least not yet at this point in time, no. So I think it's very important still to maybe for us, us journalists, to start to maybe play around with these tools, start to maybe use them so we don't get left behind, that know what they're like, know how to report on them. Honestly, nung unang report namin tong AI story, hindi talaga ako masyadong techie even though I follow like social media stories and such. I was very intimidated by it at first. Akala ko na parang napakataas ng AI as a topic. But then when I realized, when you pull back the curtain, it's not just an AI story, it's not just a tech story, but it's also a labor story and a human rights story. That's when I really felt na, okay, this is why it's very important for journalists to understand this so that we can explain it to people. And also so that if the phenomenon catches up to us in our industry, we can also understand it ourselves. Parang we can't allow ourselves as journalists to go obsolete.
I want to ask you about another recent story that you worked on for the Washington Post. It was a blockbuster, and in the opposite of futuristic, no, AI medyo futuristic pa yung storya, no. But this one reaches back over 100 years in history. Itong Searching for Maura, no. See, Maura was this Filipina who was taken from her village in the Cordillera Mountains. She was one of those Filipinos displayed at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. This was at a time, of course, when we were still a new U.S. colony, and the U.S. Colonial government, I guess, wanted to show off the people from the new colony, and how exotic we were and how interesting maybe our customs and traditions were, or their customs and traditions were in the Cordillera. Anyway, Maura was a teenager. She died, no, of pneumonia. The brain was separated from the rest of the body and then taken to the Smithsonian Institute, which is a kind of a museum complex in Washington, D.C. with research facilities. And there, her brain was one of those studied as part of this research project to see whether, the brains of our race was different from the brains of other races, and I guess in particular white races. No, anyway, you and your colleagues at the Washington Post broke this story about Maura. Although I know that some Filipino Americans have been writing about this issue for a while, no, pero it was interesting how you guys did it at the Post, because it came out as an illustrated story. No, it wasn't all text. Much of it was actually illustration. No, kind of almost like a graphic novel, but it was nonfiction. Congratulations on this story. I know you worked on this with other reporters at the Washington Post. So, what else can you add about this story, and why is it important?
Okay, thank you so much, Sir Howie. I'm really glad that pumatok talaga yung kwento. It seems not just in your book, but also with the readership. One of the reasons why it's so important is that it is the Washington Post's first Filipino language story. And when the story was, while we were working on it, and it took a team of up to 90 people of supporting the project to run it. Pero that's the whole project na, and Maura's story is just one component. And there were around 14 Filipinos also on the team, including Phil Ams. I'm the reporter who was based here. Although we do have the illustrator who's also based in the Philippines, who is Pinoy also. And one other translator who is also here. And then we have our Phil Am colleagues in the US. So that's roughly what the team was like. And our project head, si Casey Shaper, she really pushed na talagang dapat ma-release to in Filipino so that it will be more accessible to Filipinos everywhere, really, para mabasa siya by older generations and also by people at home. Because this is a project that although it has been reported on to some degree before, diba? We've heard, like at least history enthusiasts have already heard of the 1904 World Fair. But this was the first time that we're really hearing about what happened to the remains of a lot of people who went. to the World Fair. Like, we don't know na may mga labi pa pala na naiwan at nagamit pa for scientific research, which was essentially parang white supremacist in nature, 'di ba? So that aspect was very important for us Filipinos on the team na we really wanted to reclaim the story from the Filipino perspective. And Nicole Donca was one of the lead investigators. Silang dalawa ni Claire Healy, no? Nicole Donca is also Pinoy. And she's based there in the US, and she also roped all the rest of us in. So I'm really grateful to have been part of this project. It's also our first, Sir Howie, our first investigative comic.
Yeah, it's amazing, no? Imagine that phrase, no? Investigative comic, no? So talagang I mean, it shows how journalism is also being transformed. Nagkaroon ng impact itong storyang ito, no? Kasi the Smithsonian responded almost right away, right? How did your team feel about the reaction? Was it enough of a response by the Smithsonian? I know that not everyone is happy about their response.
Well, for us naman at the Post, I think you might be referring to one of the activists we covered whose story and whose work prompted also this project, Jana Año Nuevo Langhos. She released a statement saying that she did not find the Smithsonian's response to be enough. So definitely, I think that there are all these characters at play, no? But as journalists, what we're really here to do is really just tell the story. And then see how people and the public also react to it. I think what's important for us is how the community feels about it. I know that in Suyok, because Jessica Soho went and covered, no, and she interviewed the community there, and they're pleased to hear the news that there will be the remains are being planned to be shipped back na. And they plan to set up a memorial also. So I think hopefully that this could give at least some people some closure, no? Because it happened more than 100 years ago, we might think that it's an old issue. But I think as long as there are communities for whom the subjects of these stories matter, it's really still important to hear them, no? Hopefully we'll see how things pan out. We're still monitoring kasi the National Museum said na they're coordinating along with the DFA. So inaabangan pa po namin yung paano yung magiging process ng pag-repatriate ng mga labi ng Pinoy.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it coincided with the publication this year of a popular young adult novel in the UK about the same event, no? It was fictional, of course. I'm sure you've heard of Wild Song, the novel by Candy Gourlay, a Filipina British author based in London. But it has a fictional account, but based on a lot of research about the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 and how the people were trafficked there and their experience and how some of them died. So this issue is very much in the public conversation, no? So from two different directions, no? From fiction, and then you guys are doing investigative comics. Of course, this is about the Philippines. It's about Philippine history and a emotional issue between the U.S. and the Philippines. No? But it's not the only story about the Philippines that has come out in the Washington Post, and will not be the last. And that's why you're here, right? You're covering the Philippines for this very important newspaper. So for the same reason, will your stories now be translated into Filipino language so that Filipinos can also have access to future Philippine stories, or is this an exception?
Well, this is like a first, so it's very experimental in nature, as you can tell. So we're hearing out all the feedback. I think standard procedure would still be definitely to stick to English, unless there are big investigations maybe in the future. Not necessarily with the Post in particular, but other Western publications, when they have reported major stories out of the Philippines, sometimes they do get a translator. Alam ko, like, the New York Times before, I think, had a drug war story that they translated to Filipino as well. And there was also another viral story some years back of The Atlantic, written by Alex Tizon, um,
The family
about
slave.
yung family yaya nila. Yeah, my family slave, yung yaya nila who was legally brought to the US and who was not paid apparently for all these years. That was also translated into Filipino. So it seems to be that in Western publications so far, the translation treatment is given to really big stories. No, I think it's important to let these Western publications also know that there's a demand for these kinds of stories. But for sure, I think that's also why local media is there then to help us be able to cascade these stories as well, where the foreign publications can't reach.
Well, I have access to the Washington Post because I am a paying subscriber. So that's one barrier, no, to access. No, I'm saying this in the context of what somebody told me about, the huge disadvantage of quality journalism versus disinformation, or these websites that spread falsehood or hate, etc. It's all free. No, you don't have to pay for it. It's all free.
Yeah.
Versus quality journalism. Of course, it's expensive to produce quality journalism, but charging people subscription fees also becomes a barrier for people to know the truth. No, so I know that you were just overseas and you studied disinformation. Share with us. Give us some good news about it. I mean, is there hope out of this dystopia of fake news, disinformation, and how it's affecting our politics and how people view journalism in general? I mean, give us reason for optimism, naman.
Is there? Let me think. Pero yes, sir. I was in Oxford for a while, and I worked on a project about how Filipino reporters and journalists can better tackle disinformation, or report about disinformation and respond to it. So hopefully that paper will be published within the year. Nasa editing phase siya ngayon. Well, there's good news and there's bad news, sir. And I think you might know this already, that Filipinos generally are aware of disinformation as a problem. And I think there was that SWS survey earlier this year, or was it late last year, to say that Filipinos are aware and it's a problem. But the bad news, or the flip side to that, is that some Filipinos think that journalists are to blame for this problem. I think definitely one of the challenges for us, diba, finance, like you mentioned, this is one, no? Because it's expensive to have to fund good journalism and have to pay for the labor of these journalists. Whereas in disinformation naman, it's a whole cottage industry which has a never-ending well of money and funds that are untaxed, undeclared in campaign finance, diba? So the money is not quite with us. But I think that there's a challenge on the part of a journalist, no, that we have to start rethinking our business models, I think. And we have to start getting, I guess, more creative. Kaya rin it's been interesting for me to be a part of these recent investigations. Now we have our investigative comic on Maura, the AI story as well. Because I also get to see a little bit of the PR that goes into the marketing of these stories to make sure that they're read. So in the Philippine context, I think that maybe we should also be actively planning to market our investigations also as journalists. I mean, not to say that journalists themselves should do it, but the newsroom should be doing the marketing also of these investigatives. Lalo na't alam na natin ngayon na hindi na masyadong binabasa yung mga investigatives, sir, di ba? Like, not like in the early 2000s, where an investigative story could could rattle the popularity of a president. It's not like that anymore, diba? Parang a lot of stuff don't stick anymore. So I think it's one of the things that I learned was that it's very important to produce a lot of content regarding the deep reporting that we do on TikTok, on YouTube, iba't ibang formats, short form, long form, at hindi lang text, so that it can reach as many people as possible. And hopefully, not just in one language then. We should also be producing this stuff in various languages. Because that's how this information works din eh. Parang it is now targeted towards a lot of communities. Micro-targeted na siya. Hindi katulad nung 2016, di ba? Now we have all these micro-influencers parroting this information. So hopefully journalists can also build a similar type of network so that we can make sure that our stories get out there and are read and hopefully also appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously one of the reasons why we enter this profession is we want to have some kind of impact on public conversation, if not public policy, and most Filipino journalists work for Philippine media, and as you mentioned, in a previous era, Philippine media was taken a lot more seriously. It was much more influential. Political leaders would respond right away. They would even promise to reform, or they would even say sorry because of exposés or investigations that come out in Philippine media. Now, more often than not, political leaders will just ignore what the negative news about them that comes out in Philippine media, mainstream media, because they feel that we've lost influence, and and they're able to have big social media operations that can counter any negative information that comes out in the mainstream media. So that's our situation here in the Philippines. But you're in the Philippines, but you have a different situation. So you work for the Washington Post, which is, I guess, one of the top 3 or 4 most influential publications in the United States. Do you feel that because you work for the Washington Post, you still have influence? The U.S. Congress will read you. You're probably one of the few sources of U.S. political leaders, or even the U.S. Embassy in Manila, or credible sources about the Philippines for these people. And these people influence Philippine politics, diba? So in a roundabout way, you can exert a lot of influence on Philippine politics simply because there's a big presumption that U.S. political leaders and political establishment in America will read your reporting.
First, I've got to say, it's a huge privilege for me to work here. I really love my job, and I think it's great that Filipinos are also well represented in a paper like the Washington Post. This would not have been the case, Sir Howie, I think like 20 years ago, diba? Parang, and for sure, the impact of journalism overall on the public awareness, it's dwindling not just in the Philippines, but everywhere around the world. The trust in news is kind of going down. But that being said, like, since you did mention that the Washington Post is one of those publications that is safely up there, quote and unquote, no. Thankfully, because of the legacy also that the paper has built for itself over the decades. It is a huge privilege for me to work here, and I really hope that I'm stepping up to the plate, and that our investigations are useful and will be helpful for people who are observing the Philippines. In the day-to-day, though, because I do live here in the Philippines, I don't always feel every day that we have like an impact. I still feel like every other regular Filipino and every other regular Filipino journalist, that sometimes you feel like you're shouting into the void, and then it doesn't necessarily make a difference. But every now and then there might be that one story that people will give a shout out to, that people will give credit to. Um, there have been a few stories like that over the years, and sometimes it's just, in the form of a reader email, people who want to, for example, one story that we did was about a Jamaican pilot doing who was doing airlifts for medical evacuees during the pandemic. And then a lot of people reached out to want to help him. So may mga ganun pa ring may mga ganun pa ring connections, at least, that our stories make. And sometimes that's really what I enjoy as a journalist, like knowing, like you said, that hopefully these stories make a difference. But also, I guess maturing in the profession is also coming to an understanding that not every story will stick. Hopefully, though, I think the watchers in the US and elsewhere around the world will find informative stuff about our reportage here.
You've been working at the Washington Post since 2018. So you covered the Duterte administration. You did reporting on the drug war. I know you have spoken about being trolled, receiving a lot of hate for your reportage. So how did it make you feel about your choice to become a journalist? Because you're still pretty young, no? You graduated in what, 2016 from Ateneo?
Yes.
No? Yeah. So
yes, I graduated in 20.
Yeah, so just a couple of years out of college, you're kind of in this, in the eye of, you were in this vortex. Let's put it that way. No, reporting for this very influential newspaper on this very controversial administration in the Philippines. No, so how did you take that as a young journalist? Recently out of college, doing this major reportage for the Washington Post, and then getting all of this pushback from all of the fans of former President Duterte.
It's definitely, Sir Howie, like a baptism by fire, na diretso out of college. And when we were in college, I was a student journalist at the Ateneo. And we were that kind of generation that we grew up reading the big investigative stories of the 2000s as cases, no, like yung we grew up to corruption investigative cases, like actually making a difference in local politics. And then suddenly we graduated into this new administration, which was suddenly like a new norm. Parang institutions were like being like questioned, and basically the strengths of these institutions also were being tested. And for a lot of my batchmates, when we na journalists din around people my age, 'di ba yung pinakaunang assignment sa mga young reporters, yung police beat. Tapos ipapasabak sa'yo, drug war na agad. Like when I was in my first 2 years with the local media, I mostly covered from desk. Although we did have a few parang field work, no? And then when I moved to the Post, one of the very first stories that I did was to trace back a drug war case, which made the front page of the Washington Post. And that was one of the first instances that I was really met with something of a harassment campaign. And it was hard, like I have to say. Pero it was also clear to me even then that the people who were behind this campaign, that it was manufactured, that this was not necessarily an organic, parang organic hate. Parang alam mo na sketchy siya because people would message from sketchy looking accounts, people would
Mm.
message at odd times of the night, 'di ba? Parang, and this was a trend that I'd seen like in quite a number of the harassment campaigns that I got to experience, especially when I was covering that in the pandemic later on, and then the elections. Um, but Sir Howie, I also don't doubt that there are for sure people who are real also who have sent me hate mail and stuff. Like it's also because the information atmosphere that we're in is just so polluted already. And I guess that there are some people who out there who really think that it's okay to message people things like that, to message people threats, to be completely like mean and no, online. I don't know how we should go about it really, but I think that all of us, like not just journalists, no, but everyone, we all have a bit of a responsibility to reclaim our shared humanity so that sana hindi naman magiging ganito ang norm natin forever, di ba?
But that experience did not make you want to quit. Kasi you're still fairly young and you could actually shift careers and do something else that will kind of, where you don't have to deal with that harassment and even danger, di ba?
Yeah, that's true. But here's the thing, Sir Howie. I've always wanted to be a journalist. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I can picture myself doing anything else. Well, honestly, now maybe I could nowadays that I'm a little older and I realize that okay, maybe my skill set is a little more transposable than I thought it initially was. But the thing is, even until now, I still like the work of journalism. But also I don't begrudge our colleagues no na umaalis because um let's face it, it's not also like the dream job that we were once sold when we were still students. Like there's a lot of harassment, and in a way that was not present a decade ago, 'di ba? Parang it's very like it's always been something of a dangerous job in the Philippines, but then suddenly like it's also very invasive because of social media. um I'm not sure, Sir Howie. Like honestly, the stress is it gets bad. I will admit. Like I have had bad days because of the harassment campaigns that I've experienced. But I think what's one of the things that also keeps me in the profession, um, apart from the feeling that like I actually like the work, is also the community that we have. I quite like the people we work with in our industry actually. Parang it's it's an honor for me to work alongside a lot of great Filipino journalists, and parang hindi nawawala sa akin yung idea that etong etong privilege na makapag-report tungkol sa Pilipinas, it did not come from anywhere. It was inherited from journalists who came before me, who pushed for our industry to have the freedoms that it has. So it's very important to me to be able to tell stories that will try to keep that space of freedom for us in the industry, even if it's constantly dwindling. So as long
Yeah,
as I can, hindi ko na siyang romanticize, or Howie, I gotta say. Kasi in my early 20s maybe, or siguro when I was a college student, parang like, gung-ho, excitable about everything. But now I don't romanticize it. It's a job like any other job. But so far, I can still stomach it and it's not too bad.
well, as an older journalist, that's really heartwarming to hear that someone like you and at your age, still wants to persist, because I do remember that when I entered journalism around your age, back in the 80s, it was still considered a noble profession, and nobody hated you, even if you wrote critical stories, di ba? I mean, some people would, but in general, the average person had a high respect for you and for what you did, and it's just changed changed a lot, no? But you mentioned earlier that you can't imagine yourself being anything but a journalist. But you're a published poet. I know that's not a profession, not your profession. No, but I recall reading one of your poems, the Happiness Index, which was not a happy poem. Is there a connection between your mood there and your being a journalist? I mean, I guess it would be understandable for you to have that tone and be experiencing harassment at the same time because of your job as a journalist.
Actually, Sir Howie, now that you bring it up, maybe you're right. It's not entirely true yung sinabi ko earlier that I can't imagine doing anything else. Because when I was younger, when I was a kid, I wanted to become a writer. In general, parang not necessarily a journalist. Pero nagkataon lang na in the Philippine context, I guess it would be journalism is easier to sell, or parang that's what would give you a day job if you're a writer. Parang poetry naman can't put food on the table. So I joined the school paper, but I've always been fond of creative writing, to be honest. So I still try to practice it here and there a little bit. I think my poetry and my journalism complement each other a bit. So there are some stuff that don't make the editorial cut, which stay with me in the form of images, ideas. Tapos pinaglalaroan ko siya in the form of poetry. I guess yung Happiness Index, this is one poem that was published sa Taludtod. And it was basically about alam niyo yung parang happy economies and stuff, but I feel like Filipinos are, like, may branding tayo as a happy people, but deep inside, like, we're not very happy. That was the idea that I wanted to play with there, because like, look at our traffic, look at our yung climate crisis dito sa atin, ganyan. Parang, we just slap on a smile and then push through, but that doesn't mean that we're actually happy. So I kind of, it's very hard to talk about these things, I guess, in the form of like news reports. Ang boring naman. But if you play around with imagery, I think poetry is another way to talk about it that hopefully also tickles the minds of whoever reads it.
Yeah, you're also a Carlos Palanca winner.
That was for poetry back in 2019. Okay. I had a suite of poems that was mostly about Mindanao and growing up in Mindanao and the 2013 Zamboanga siege, which happened when I was a college student. So it was mostly in a style that was a little reportorial in its voice, actually. So doon parang naglalaro yung persona ng journalist and poet, and some poems are probably up online if people want to read them.
Thank you for sharing your observations and insights today, and thank you especially for your dedication to our profession and to coverage of the Philippines. Regine Cabato, Philippine correspondent for the Washington Post, published poet and Palanca Award winner. Mabuhay ka.
Thank you so much, Sir Howie. Mabuhay ka rin po. Thank you, thank you.
Hi, I'm Howie Severino. Check out the Howie Severino Podcast, an original for GMA News and Public Affairs. New episodes will stream every Thursday. Listen for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and other platforms.
The views expressed by guests of the Howie Severino Podcast do not represent the podcast or GMA Integrated News.